Hi everyone, my name is Paul Adepoju and I'm the community manager for the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And since the pandemic became a global pandemic in early 2020, we've been organizing a series of webinars that are aimed at expanding the knowledge base of journalists in the area of science. And so far, we've covered a wide range of issues, ranging from core genetics to general issues, all of which have direct or indirect impact on the pandemic. But a few weeks ago, we had a session on on mental health, and it became obvious that in the course of journalists carrying out their activities, sometimes the mental health of the respondents, of individuals that we are trying to talk to, could sometimes not be properly handled. And so this level of awareness have been with our members, especially those that attended the webinar and those that read the stories on HygieNet and and those that watched the replay videos on YouTube and elsewhere. So today we are taking a step further to expand the knowledge base of journalists on how to actually handle trauma-related scenarios, especially individuals. How do you interview individuals that have just gone through what could actually be the worst moment in their lives? And we are journalists, and our core professionalism and experience and expertise is in reporting stories. And for us to be able to actually report trauma-linked stories accurately well, we also have to have a broad knowledge base on how to do this. And that is why today we have somebody that I'm going to call a friend of the house, who has actually been here before and as a freelance journalist. But today she will be sharing a knowledge base and also providing some guidance on how to do trauma-related stories. How are you doing today, Nicole?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm really happy and thanks for joining us today. If you are watching, if you are joining us on the Zoom platform and you have any questions to ask Nicole, please go ahead and start putting those questions in the chat box, in the Q&A option on the Zoom platform. And if you are watching the live stream on Facebook, I encourage you to put your questions in the comment box below the live stream that you are watching. And before we take the presentation, the first, I know Nicole has slides for us, but I would like Nicole to help us draw the connection between trauma reporting and COVID. Is there a slight connection between the two, Nicole?
Absolutely. I think that um, since COVID started, journalists have been uniquely in this space where we're actually trying to cover something that is really traumatic. And speaking from personal experience, like COVID-19 actually did give me trauma. Like I was not diagnosed with PTSD. So it's something that is really important for journalists to know because when we're on the ground, like we have to pay attention to what our interviewees are saying and how they're feeling. And it's not, I'm going to say this a little bit later in my presentation, but one of the things that is really important is that when you're reporting on traumatic events, you can't put the story before the interview subject. And I think that's very much true for COVID.
Yeah, I actually agree with you. So, can you start sharing your screen? And once the screen is up, I'll start talking. So, like I said, once again, we are not expected to cover everything today. This is expected to be a starting point to expand your knowledge base on how to handle trauma stories. And I think Nicole is ready. So, Nicole, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much for having me again. I'm really excited to talk about this. Yeah, like this is going to be a trauma-informed reporting presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and what I do. And then from there, I'm going to tell you guys how I approach trauma-informed reporting. Um, and yeah, there is a content note for this. I'm going to be mentioning sexual violence and gendered violence. It's not going to be anything that's like explicit or anything, but I'd like to give a content note. So here's me. I am a writer, researcher, translator, and journalist currently working from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I have 2 degrees in women's studies, and I actually wrote a PhD thesis on #MeToo reporting. My areas of coverage are violence against women, sexual violence, feminism and prison abolition, and state violence. So from what I want you to know about me in terms of trauma informed reporting is that I cover a lot of gendered violence, a lot of sexual violence. So the perspective that I'm bringing here is based on my experience doing that kind of reporting. So that'll be interviewing victims of sexual violence, victims of domestic violence, all that stuff. And that's what I have, the most experience with. But I do think that it can be extrapolated into other kinds of trauma, how kind of like careful we can be with people who are victims of one thing or another. But that's what the important thing here is to say, like, I have this experience in a very specific area of gendered violence. So it's not really about, war zones or atrocities. It's more about kind of like this personal space of gendered violence and suffering trauma and interpersonal relationships. But I do think that those things can be extrapolated. So I want to start really simply. What is gender-based trauma? And I think that it's really important for most, or if not all, journalists to understand what gender-based trauma is. Since the start of #MeToo, since Ronan Farrow exposed Harvey Weinstein, like, I think that it has become necessary for journalists to understand how gender-based trauma works, because since he opened that kind of can of worms, it's just become so obvious to me that there's so many of these stories that are underreported, are not being reported, or if they are being reported, they're being reported in a very careless way. And I'm going to give some examples of different stories that I didn't like and stories that I did like later on in the presentation. But it's important to know that gender-based violence refers to violence that is directed against a person because of their gender. Women are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence due to power inequalities between women and men. Traumas include physical injuries and psychologically and/or emotionally deeply distressing experiences. So I don't want to get too much into what that means, but what I do want to say is when I'm talking about gender-based trauma, I don't necessarily only mean women. It might also be men, or it might also be non-binary people. There are loads of ways that gender-based trauma can come up for a person. So while obviously, because of the world we live in and gender inequality, we operate from a perspective of, okay, women are more vulnerable to this stuff, but I also want to note that that's not the whole story, and that's something that you should keep in mind, that anyone can be a victim of gender-based trauma. It depends what happens, and it depends how they reacted and what their traumatic response was. So that's kind of the work that I do. I sometimes report on gender-based trauma. I've done stories where I've interviewed domestic violence victims. I've interviewed women who have done illegal abortions in Brazil. And all of this requires a caring approach to the person that you're interviewing and the story that you're trying to write. So I thought I would talk about kind of why do journalists need to deal with trauma. Understanding trauma and how to navigate it in your interview It'll help you get a clearer picture of the story you're trying to report on. Because, for example, if you're reporting on someone who was sexually assaulted, you can't just look at, if you understand trauma, you don't just look at that one instance of violence as that one instance of violence. You understand it as something that has affected that person throughout their life. So if you understand trauma, you understand that the story isn't just that one night that person was sexually assaulted. No, that one night that person was sexually assaulted and they were robbed of their bodily autonomy, and that creates trauma. So that gives you a clearer picture of what you're trying to report on. It's not just a single event. It's actually something that happens in a system where, women are subjugated to men. And it also means that you don't dehumanize your interview subject. What does that mean? One thing that I'm going to be coming back to over and over in this presentation is the fact that when you're reporting on traumatic events, be that sexual violence, be that gender violence, be that some kind of war zone, an atrocity, a shooting, when you understand trauma, you understand that the interview subject comes before your story. And that's what's different about reporting on trauma than from, reporting on, like, I don't know, a pop culture trend, right? Is that the story never comes before the subject, the survivors of that you are interviewing. So you always have to put the survivors first, the survivors' well-being first. And then also, survivors of gendered violence need to have reliable professionals to take their grievances seriously, to listen and report on what's happened carefully. And the reason I say this is because I think that #MeToo became a really sexy subject. I'm not saying that to be like dismissive, but I do think that a lot of the media has tried to jump onto the #MeToo subject to get views and all that stuff. That's just like the digital journalism world that we live in. But what we really need is reliable professionals to take grievances seriously, actually listen, and rather than produce a story for clicks, if that makes sense. This is what I just mentioned. As I said, I'm going to be saying this several times. Reporting on traumatic events is different from most journalism. You have to let your ego go to do this kind of work. You cannot put your byline in front of what the subject of your story is. When we're reporting on traumatic events, the well-being of the people we're interviewing, the well-being of the people we're speaking to and who are sharing with us one of their most disturbing parts of their life, we have to put their well-being first before the story. And I think that this brings up a lot of issues, especially for those of us who are freelancers, because often as freelancers, we don't have a lot of support. And this kind of story, in my opinion, requires a lot of editorial support, a lot of fact-checking support, a long time to build trust with your subject. So, that does bring up issues with for people who are freelancers, because we don't have that. We don't have time, right? Like we have to like keep producing so we can get a paycheck and pay the rent. So, if you're a freelancer and you're hoping to do something like this, what I recommend is that like you find an editor who will be on your corner and like really believes in the story as much as you do, because if you sell it to the wrong person, it's going to be detrimental for you and for the person who is going on record for you. So yeah, when you're interviewing someone who's traumatized, you cannot and should not prioritize the story. Your priority is the survivor that you're interviewing. If the survivor decides to retract their interview, your job is to give up on the story. And I know that's super difficult. As journalists, we want to expose all the bad in the world. We want to report on what's going on. But that's what it is. Like it just simply has to be something that you're doing to prioritize the people in the story rather than the actual story. And yeah, like as I said before, this isn't the kind of story that can be done in a week. Usually it takes a few months to build trust with your interviewees, and you should always leave the possibility of retraction open. And I'll get back to that later on, because I'm going to talk about tips that you should have in mind when you're interviewing someone who's very traumatized. So I'm going to go through 2 case studies of reporting about sexual violence where one of them I feel like wasn't very well done, and it was done for the wrong reason. And then I'm going to go through another case study where I thought that it was really well done and came from a caring perspective. And then we're going to kind of like try to tease out the kind of tips that we can get out of these 2 examples. So I don't know how much people remember about babe.net and Aziz Ansari when he was exposed for a case of sexual misconduct. I won't get into it because it wasn't, I don't want to trigger anybody. So, but I don't know how much you know about this, but I think this was published maybe like a week after the Harvey Weinstein expose by Ronan Farrow. And it was very much driven by the fact that #MeToo was really taking social media by storm. And these kinds of stories were kind of trending. And babe.net only had kind of like 3,000 followers at the time before this story. So, in my opinion, kind of from someone from the outside, it felt like they were doing it for the views, to get attention and all that stuff. Obviously, there was a reason of like, I want this survivor to have a voice. But trending stories should never be the motivation for publishing sexual violence stories, gendered violence stories, because these stories take time to actually tease out, bring together. So here are a few problems that I found in this case study. The style of writing was really confessional rather than journalistic, so it ended up reading like a gossip column. So that doesn't really give a lot of credibility to the survivor. It's kind of like, well, if she, it gives space for people to say like, well, she could have gone to the New York Times. Well, she could have gone to a more reliable, reporter. And a lot of this story was really kind of bringing, like, a lot of people who read the story were just like really questioning it. And that's like, your job as a journalist who is reporting on this stuff is to try to guard against that. Because when a survivor of gendered violence, when a survivor of anything comes to you and wants to tell you their story, they're making themselves vulnerable to visibility. They're making themselves vulnerable to being a public survivor. And that's a huge deal. So as a journalist, you need to guard against all these possible misreadings, all these possible questionings. And then there was also a mention of what the survivor was wearing, and it read like, she saddled on a tank top, dress, and jeans. She showed me a picture. It was a good outfit. Like, it seems innocuous, but it's not really useful for a story to comment on a survivor's clothing, nor is it useful to write it in such a confessional gossip column way. It just feels like the whole, the website and the person who wrote it, they weren't really taking the whole thing seriously. They just wanted to get it out there. I think I was reading about it yesterday, and they basically got the story out in like a week. They found the story, wrote the story, published the story in a week, which is not enough time And like, yeah, they gave Aziz Ansari 6 hours to respond rather than 24 hours. Yeah, and it was put together in a week, which it doesn't give anybody enough time to fact check, to respond, or find the story, or find other stories that might help support the original survivor. So what happened was, this woman, even though she was anonymous, was led to confessing one of her worst moments. And then everyone was questioning it because this wasn't done in a way that was caring. It wasn't done in a way that was trauma informed. It was done to kind of jump on a trend. And I feel like the editors of babe.net, like it doesn't, I don't think it's live anymore. Babe.net, like I think it's kind of like a failed platform by this point. But if I were those editors, I would really regret doing that. And then I'm also recommending that you Google this piece, Babe, What Are You Doing by Julianne Escobedo Shepherd on Jezebel, because they give like a really good rundown of what Babe.net did wrong. And it's just a really good read. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. Okay, so case study 2, the New Yorker and Harvey Weinstein. I actually went really deep into this report because it was a part of my PhD thesis. So I actually know quite a lot about it. And I think, and I've read it like a million times, so I know it really well. But here are the bullet points. Ronan Farrow spent 10 months researching and speaking to the survivors of Harvey Weinstein's behavior. The fact-checking process was exhaustive. And though not all of the survivors were identified, some were, which gives the story credibility. I want to go back to the fact-checking process. When you read that story, you realize that there's so much more than he said, she said. There are police reports, there are recordings, there are emails, there are NDAs, there is a wealth of physical evidence, physical documental evidence that backs up what those survivors are saying. Why did Ronan Farrow do this? I don't know. I have to talk to him. But I think the reason they did that is that they wanted to push the story beyond he said, she said. They wanted to show that there is definitively a way to report on these stories where evidence can be physical, it can be documental, it can be further than a verbal statement. So there are ways to prove this stuff, or at least to prove that two people were in that place, or that someone coerced someone into doing into not telling the story of what happened. So the NDAs and all that stuff. So I thought that part of that story was really, really well done. Unlike the babe.net story, it took months to do. It wasn't hopping on a trend. It was really centering the survivors. I also read Ronan Farrow's book. He talks a lot about how some of the survivors didn't want to go on record sometimes, and he met with them over and over and over again. He talked to them exhaustively for hours, days. So this was a massive, massive, massive undertaking. And throughout the story, Farrell emphasizes how powerful Weinstein is several times. And the tone is serious rather than conversational. And why do I point this out? Because Weinstein, it would be easy to say, oh, like, why did these women do this? Or like, why were these women in the same room as Weinstein or whatever? But, Ronan Farrow wanted to consistently say, like, look at how powerful this man is. Look at how powerful this person is. Is there any way that these women could have said no and safely left the place that they were in, or safely had a career in Hollywood? So he makes the stakes really, really clear. And he also takes care not to victim blame or mention details that might lead the reader to victim blame. So, what I mentioned before about mentioning the outfit and talking about the victim's outfit or the survivor's outfit, unless there is something that's like really, really important for the story. For example, I think that there's a bit in this piece, which by the way, everyone should read. I think there's a bit in this piece where one of the victims says that she purposefully dressed frumpy so that she wouldn't be attractive to Weinstein. So like that is a detail of the story that isn't something that someone can take and say a victim blame. Like they can't take that and say like, oh wow, you were wearing an outfit and so like you deserved it. No, like it was something that the victim was saying, like, I did this to protect myself and it still didn't work. So, you have to have really, really strong discernment to know which details to put in. And that requires a lot of support. I imagine that this story was edited to death, was very, very read, was read by loads of people in the New Yorker, and obviously very exhaustively fact-checked. Oh, and this is a point I've already made, but yeah, there's a wealth of evidence in the story. If you go there, if you go on the link, if you go on the actual article, I'm pretty sure it's not paywall. There's loads of stuff that's just like embedded into the story. Like there's recordings that you can play. They're very triggering, but there's stories that you can play. I think they also publish some NDAs in full as well. You can like see them as PDFs. And there's police reports. There's the fact checkers called people to say like, oh, were you there on this day at this date with this person, to like certify that that story was real. So yeah, as I said, that takes the story beyond he said, she said. And then also one thing that I think is really interesting about the story is that it doesn't rely, unlike the babe.net story, which tells one instance of sexual violence, the Weinstein one actually shows a range of unacceptable behavior from Weinstein, which makes the stories way more credible, because it doesn't become because it stops being just like, oh, he did this one thing this one time. No, it becomes a pattern. And that's why the story is so good. Okay, so Paul, how much time do we have left? I know that I went over last time.
Yeah, so how far do you still have to go? How many minutes do you still think you need?
Not that much, not that much. This is like I have two slides left.
5 minutes? Can you be done in
Yeah,
5 minutes? Okay.
I can do that. Okay, cool. I just don't want to go over again.
No, it's okay.
Okay, cool. Okay, so now we're getting into probably what you're actually here for, which is tips for building trust with sources. I do want to say I haven't been formally trained on this. This is more like the fact that I'm a survivor myself, and I spent 5 years studying reports of sexual violence, and I've also reported on sexual violence, and I've also reported on gendered violence for the last 10 years. So these are tips that I have kind of, I feel like they're common sense. But when I was writing them down, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is actually really interesting. So the first thing that I want to say is that you have to have patience. Your source might need breaks. You should make clear that this is an available option. And I don't mean that just as like you're having this long interview and then you have a 5-minute break. No, like sometimes they will need days to recover, because survivors usually have PTSD. So, and depending on the kind of like recovery time from being triggered, you might have to go back to that survivor over and over again until they actually trust you. And also, like, you never know what might trigger them. So even though sometimes you might be like really careful with your language, like instead of saying, why did you do this? It's better to say like, what happened? Tell me how comfortable, like tell me what you're comfortable telling me. So be patient, use common sense, be empathetic. And part of that is also assuring the interview subject that you're a safe person to speak to about this topic. And what does this mean? You have to remember that when someone has been traumatized, one thing that has happened is like they've been brutally robbed of their autonomy. So one of the things that you can do as a reporter is try to give that autonomy back in some small ways. So for example, I always say things like, tell me how as much as you're comfortable with, or you can always retract. You can always go back. I don't need to name you, or would you like to be anonymous? So it's part of kind of like an informed consent kind of dynamic. Informing the subject of the possible consequences of going on record is important, and it shows that your source that you care about their safety. So for example, if we go back to babe.net, they actually looked for the survivor and begged her to go on record, which isn't really where you want to be as a reporter. Like, you want to have a collaborative approach with your interviewee. It's not, you want to abolish the hierarchy that there is between journalist and interviewee. And yeah, you just try to show that you care about their safety. The option to retract always has to be made clear as well. It might seem counterintuitive to journalism, but it's a central pillar of the rules of consent, and it will make them more comfortable. Knowing that they can go back, knowing that you care more about them than the actual story, can go a long way in like actually building trust. Honesty and transparency. People who have trauma from sexual and or gender violence often feel like they're not in control of their lives because of how they've been violated. This means that you have to be honest and transparent about the story you're trying to write, what kind of protection you can give them, anonymity, for example, and what the consequences of speaking out might be. We don't want to be reporters who expose people for the story and then don't care about the consequences. That's just not good for anybody. So yeah, like being transparent. I usually start my interviews by saying, this is the story that I'm trying to write. These are your options. You can be anonymous, you can go on record. If you go on record, these might be the consequences. So being honest about who you are, and sometimes I even say like, I'm really interested in this topic because XYZ, and that really helps. And the last one is consent. One thing to remember is that we could re-traumatize our interview subjects as we're doing this kind of reporting. You have to make clear that you can stop the interview anytime they need to stop, and that you're only interested in what they're comfortable sharing. And also, this also requires some discernment from your part, from you as a reporter. If you're talking to someone who is too traumatized and hasn't processed their trauma enough for you to actually speak to them, you have to be the person who says like, actually, you're not ready to do this. Like, you have to have that discernment. As I said, always put the well-being of their interviewee before the actual story. And only two left. Sorry, Paul. Care. So like one thing that I do sometimes is when I interview the survivors, I'll have a list of resources handy, so I can give them resources in case they do get triggered. So this would be like, a suicide hotline maybe, or a national domestic abuse hotline, or all these things that might be able to require specialized help, whatever it is that you're reporting on, look for something that would give those victims help. And then also remember, like, for example, I'll give you an example. I just did a story about cybersecurity and domestic violence and stalkerware. And one of the things that happened was someone got in touch with me and they were telling me their story, and I used the story in the reporting. And then I emailed them back and I said, hey, as I was researching for the story, I found all these resources. You should check them out. Because we're not just reporting on vessels, like empty vessels of trauma, like those people are human. If you found something to help them, why wouldn't you share? So, and that shows that you care and that you care beyond the story. So yeah, that's something that I have started doing and I've never regretted it. And the last item is make sure you're not reporting about the story just because of a byline. You have to care about the subject to do a good job. Writing from a place of care is essential for good journalism about gendered violence. And I would add about any kind of traumatizing event. Do you care about what's happening? Do you care about the people it affected? If not, maybe try to write something else. And then I have like a list of resources. I can send this to Paul later, but it's just a few articles that I found that have like really interesting perspectives on this. And then the last one, journalism and trauma, is a free it's a free course on Pointer about journalism and trauma. So I haven't checked it out. I just found it and I thought it would be interesting to mention it. And then all the other ones are kind of articles that I've kind of used or have found really interesting. And yeah, that's all. I'll leave this there so people can take photos or screenshots or whatever.
No. I think what we can do is you send the link or the presentation to me, and I'll get it across um, to the attendees, because I wouldn't want it to distract us from the conversations that we are would like to have.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah,
Um.
don't worry.
Oh, okay. You got it.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you very much, Nicole, for that extensive and thorough, all-encompassing presentation, which, like you rightly said, is not everything, but actually provides an insight, a starting point, and also uh, presents how journalists should be thinking beyond just the byline, especially when dealing with trauma-leading stories. So there are lots of comments and questions already, and let me take as much as I can take so that you can answer them. So there is one from an anonymous attendee. It reads thus: if the interview retracts after already doing and recording the interview and just before publishing, how do you deal with this? Given he or she already gave consent earlier and signed a consent form, and given the production costs that were already incurred, do we have the right to publish?
I would argue no. I don't think it matters the bureaucracy that you have done prior to actually publishing the piece. One of the worst things to happen is that like when someone is traumatized because they are violated in the sense of sexual violence, one of the things that they feel is that they don't have control over their own lives. So if you publish it, you will be re-traumatizing that person because that's going to be another thing that is being done to them in a non-consensual way. So, my advice would be deal with it and don't publish it because, that story ultimately does not belong to you. It belongs to the survivor. That's one of the most humiliating, you know, parts of their life. So I would argue that you probably shouldn't publish it, but I know that's really difficult.
Yeah, okay. The next question is from Jennifer. Jennifer's question goes thus. I'd like the speaker to address how she approaches language and word choices in her reporting, using words like victim or saying, in quotes, a woman was raped versus a man raped. In brackets, passive versus active voice. Also, how do you address it when people say, why did a woman wait several years to report? No one waits. They find the right time. Thank you. So what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that in the resources that I linked, there are a couple of guides as to like how to deal with that, and the language that we use. Um, Personally, when I'm writing about gendered violence, I don't use the word victim. I use the word survivor. But I personally think that sometimes those can be interchangeable. It's a huge like philosophical question in feminist circles actually, and I have written about this before. I can send you a link about it. Of course, language is really, really important. I think maybe one of the things to take care is seeing like how the survivor defines themselves. Like, do they define themselves as a survivor, or do they define themselves as a victim? And then the second part of the question, when you were talking about like, oh, like the passive voice and the active voice, that's literally one of my biggest pet peeves in the world. Like when I see headlines um, that are like, adult man like had sex with a child or whatever, it's just like, it's not sex, right? That's a passive way to say that someone was violated. Um, so on the other hand, when you use the word rape, that can be very triggering for some people. So it's difficult. It's a really, really difficult question to really get into, like in these like 5 minutes that I have to respond to you. All I can say is um, pay attention to what the cues that the victim or the survivor is giving you. How do they self-define? Um, Try not to use the passive voice for what the actual perpetrator did. So like try to really put this harm on his plate, or their plate, and like try to. There are kind of guides around this. I'm gonna, when I send the slide, like you'll see that there are some guides about this. So that will be a little helpful. And then the last part, wait, can you repeat the last part?
Okay, while we figure out the last part, I think I also have an addition, something to add to that question that you can take. Even when you've checked all the boxes and you've gotten now, you've been able to accurately, at least to the best of your ability, present how the victim or how the survivor or whatever the person wants to use wants to be captured. But your editor decides to use something different entirely. So, how do you engage the editor? Who do you listen to? The editor who believes in the organization's editorial standard for presentation of situation, or
Yeah.
do you compel your editor to abide by what the person you spoke to wants?
Okay, so that's a really good question, because I'm sure that this happens a lot. Like it has never happened to me on this particular subject, but it has happened in other capacities, right? That you're trying to portray a certain community in a certain way, and then that editor is like, no, like I actually think it's more like this, even though like you're the person on the ground who's actually doing the reporting, and that's really, really frustrating. Um, this is why when I was talking about this, I earlier I said like you have to find an editor who believes the same things that you do about the story. if you're working with an editor that you don't trust, I recommend that you don't actually do that story with the editor that you don't trust. It has to be someone that you have worked with before and you understand have like similar values as you. Um, but how to navigate? I think that we should always try to argue for the survivor and for the safety of the survivor, and we have to really put our cards on the table and say, if you do this, you will be putting someone's life at risk. If you do this, if you write it this way, this person will be re-victimized and re-traumatized. Like, I don't think that we should be afraid of saying that these things will happen, because they will. So I think that maybe the way that I would negotiate it, like, as I said, it's never happened to me before. But the way that I would negotiate it is I would really put my cards on the table on the regards of like, this person shared this story with us. Like, you have to respect their wishes.
Okay, more questions are for you. Another question, two questions actually from Minglim. So it starts with appreciation and good words. Great presentation, much appreciated. Could you share a few more examples of bad reporting that are still being done nowadays? Then the second question is, would you be able to share some thoughts on survivors who are also minors?
Um, okay, so the first question is really good because there is a case that I've been following um, for the past year or so, and it was, I don't remember the name of the survivor because frankly, like, she has pretty much been exposing the publication for being totally careless with her. But it happened in the like video games journalism field. And uh it made, like, basically the report made all the mistakes that I mentioned, like mention her, the victim's clothing, and also like that she had a previous relationship as a mentee with her abuser, and didn't really, it was just, it just took the story to a level that wasn't necessary. But I can't remember the publication at the moment. um but I think that these stories are always going to happen. Like, these things are always going to be published because um, we, as journalists, we're not really trained to deal with trauma, even though we should be. So, that's something that, and especially sexual trauma, like, we don't know that much about it. Like, this has been stuff that I've learned like on the job, and I should have known it already. So I hope that answers your question. I don't really want to give that story like a whole lot of attention, really, because I think it's a bad story and like people should know about it. Which is why I've never written about it, even though like I've wanted to.
Yeah.
And then, would you be able to share some thoughts on survivors who are also minors? Um, I am actually working on a story where a lot of the survivors are minors. Um, and I think that whatever care we take with adult survivors, we have to like triple the care that we're taking with minors. Um, I don't know if it's always necessary for you to interview minors who have been victims of this. I sometimes think that it might just be better to rely on the facts rather than re-traumatize the child. Um, so it's difficult, but on the story that I'm working on, what I'm doing is I'm interviewing a lot of experts. I'm interviewing a lot of psychologists to understand what the impact of this kind of thing is on the child. Um, and that's all I can see. That's all I can say about that, really.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this should be the last question that I will ask you on this. So, before your final remarks. So, interesting question. So, let me read. If survivors ask for money to share their story, How would you deal with that? Don't you think it's their right to ask for this? As this also takes us to another point, what benefits do they get from sharing their stories in the first place? And the second question from the same person, has COVID impacted your approach, and could you share how you work within the pandemic?
Okay, so the first question about money. I have never had the experience of someone asking me for money to share their story, but it is a really good question as to like what do survivors gain from sharing their stories? Like, and that's a question I ask myself a lot, truly. I actually wrote a piece about Me Too and Me Too memoirs, like books about sexual violence and all that stuff, and how strange it is that we're monetizing people's like worst moments. And it's something that I think about a lot. Like, what do they get from this? Um, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily wrong for a survivor to ask for that, because ultimately being a survivor is really, really expensive because you have to do a lot of therapy. You sometimes have to take time off. You have to, redouble your self care because you're basically coming back from an extremely traumatic event. So being a survivor is expensive. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to ask for money. Um, I actually don't know a lot of survivors who have done that though, unless it's like, oh, they're writing a memoir and then they sell their memoir and all that stuff. And in that case, I think, you know, I think I forgot, like, forgot her name, but basically, I just think like if if someone wants to tell their story in a book, like, and get money for it, I actually don't have a problem with it. Um, but I don't think that's like a common practice really in journalism. Um, and the last question about like how I've modified my the way that I work. I think that the biggest change for me has been trying to be really caring about everybody that I'm trying to interview. Because sometimes I feel like we just want to get the story out, we just want to get the byline. But sometimes it's like we're all deeply traumatized because of COVID. Like I just want to be real and just say that because that's just the reality. We're all deeply traumatized. So when someone makes a mistake, or in terms of like, oh, I thought that my interview was today, but it's actually tomorrow, or misses an appointment with me, I'm just like, you know what, it's totally fine. And I just kind of like try to let go of control and just try to think like everybody's a human who has been going through this horrible, horrible, horrible time. Um, and I think that has been like the biggest change for me, that I am trying to be like extra understanding. I think I was already understanding before, but like I'm like extra understanding now.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. And so before we wrap up, do you have any last remarks? Okay, before your last remark, let me ask when you heard about the latest COVID variant, how did that make you feel?
Terrified. um, I think it's difficult because like because I'm in Brazil, I haven't gotten my booster shot yet because they go by like age group, and I'm obviously like on the younger side. So that has been really difficult because I'm just like, oh my God, like, is it all gonna happen again? So it's hard, and a lot of the things that I've done, and I know that this is maybe like a very problematic thing to say, but I've literally muted COVID-19 on my Twitter because it otherwise it's such a barrage of like everything's terrible. Like, yeah, like I put down like several boundaries around my social media, and when I want to know about COVID, I go on the Guardian website and I look at like the latest news.
That's a really, really smart move. Yeah. So, any last remarks regarding this subject that we discussed today? What do you think the major take home for journalists should be?
I think that the main thing that I want everyone to take away from this is that when we're reporting on stories, we're reporting on humans. We're not reporting on stories, we're reporting on humans and humanity. And that's the most important thing to keep in mind. That person has a whole story behind them that you don't know, and you have to be open to listen before you're open to actually writing the story. So being a good listener goes a really long way.
Okay, so I quickly checked. I think that's all we are able to take. That's all the question. Okay, Jennifer, before you go, Jennifer, I would like to know your background, journalism school, why you are in Brazil, where you are from, those kind of things.
Okay, okay. I have okay, so I have a degree in journalism from the University of Sheffield in the UK, but I'm actually originally from Brazil. So that's why I'm in Brazil. I live here now. I studied abroad for a really long time. And now I'm here and I'm trying to do reporting on the ground here. And I did my 2 degrees in England as well. So my education's all over the place, and a lot of the stuff that I tell you is not even from my education. It's just like things that I've learned on the way.
Yeah, so thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today. And before we call it a day, I would also like to quickly address the elephant in the room. Towards the end of last week, we thought we had the whole COVID-19 reporting figured out, but around late Thursday last week, we heard the news about the emergence of the Omicron variant, and we've heard there has been lots of information that are flying around about what is peculiar about these particular variants, and even the from the science ecosystem that is supposed to provide some clarifications. We read two major executives the two companies that have produced COVID vaccines also providing what could be seen as conflicting reports about the capabilities of existing vaccines to be able to quickly respond and deal with the new variant. However, I would like to inform you that this time next week we'll be having an extensive discussion on the Omicron variant. So please come around and get all your information, accurate information from our panelists. So we are going to be hosting a professor of virology and a bioinformatician who will be telling us about all the mutations and what this really means for the response. But whatever you've heard, just know that unlike other variants, this particular variant has more mutations than the rest, and a lot of these mutations are located in the part of the virus that is important for the infection of the host cells, and this is the reason why the conversations around reinfection are very, very strong. But earlier today, we heard from the WHO and also some experts that are suggesting that quickly rolling out vaccines could still protect some form of protection to people from having severe diseases. So please come around next week to have all the information that I think will be relevant for your reporting. But before then, if you are desiring to write any stories around Omicron insights, if you are desiring to have accurate reports, I have some suggestions of the kind of stories that you can write. For instance, you can track whether your country is doing enough for sequencing to be able to actually identify the particular variant. You can also track how late or how frequent or how late does your country make this report. There is a particular tool that is called GSAID that is serving as a central repository of database for gene sequences. So you can check it out, how many sequences have been submitted from your country, and you can also ask your health experts what they expect, what kind of changes they expect should be introduced for your country to be better positioned to combat this particular new variant. So those are the tips that I have for you, and I hope you are going to apply them in your reports. But to next week Thursday, we are going to have an extensive discussion. We are going to dissect everything that you need to know, so that you can be able to easily and quickly separate the fact from the fictions regarding Omicron and the SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 pandemic in general. I want to appreciate you for being with us today, and for more information on the ICFJ's COVID-19 reporting, please, and COVID-19 efforts for journalists, please check out the International Center for Journalists website on www.icfj.org, and to also access resources, including previous insight topics that we've discussed and other resources that are relevant for your journalism career, please check out the IJNet website on www.ijnet.org. And when Nicole shares her slides with me, as I think she's doing it right now, I'm going to also share it with you on the forum, on the Facebook group that we have. So if you are not a member of that Facebook forum, please go to Facebook and search for ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. Once again, go to Facebook and search for ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. Request to join the group. You'll be admitted to the group and you'll be able to access resources. So until next time, when I'll be joining you, when I'll be hosting our panelists and other experts, I say thank you very much,